Good morning, how are you? Good. I too would like to honour the traditional owners of this land, and I'd also like to honour each and every one of you for the difference that you make, and I mean that, each and every one of you, for the difference that you make for the men and boys and for the fathers and families in your lives. I don't need to know you to know that you make a difference. People who don't make a difference don't come in sitting rooms like this to have conversations like this. So thank you for the difference that you make. And you know, when you're in something, you don't always know how great it is. And I just want to really honour the men's movement in Australia, which, and I'm fairly expert in this, which as far as I can see is the strongest, most connected, most dynamic and relevant men's movement anywhere in the world. And I really want you to just take that in, because I know you'll all face struggles, and I know you'll find it difficult, and I know you'll all be aware of how much better it could be and how much more you could do. But I also want you to be able to stop and hear it from me as an outsider, that this is, I promise you, the strongest, most dynamic, most exciting men's movement anywhere in the world. And you can change the world by acting local and thinking global. And you do think global, which is why here, me, an Englishman, and Warren, an American, are standing and sitting, speaking to you today. So thank you for all that you do, because it inspires us in the work, certainly inspires me in the work that I do in the UK. I won't speak for anyone else, but it inspires me in the work that I do in the UK and my brothers in the UK. So thank you. So, bit of my background. I've been a father for 16 years, separated when my daughter was 2, so I was an at-home dad. I am a separated dad. I've been a stepdad for a while. I've had a stepmother in my daughter's life, so I get all the dynamics, most of the dynamics of, or many of the dynamics of family life. We know there's many, many more, right? And I sort of got interested in sort of father work. Well, I suppose I got interested in father work as an at-home dad. I lived in what was supposed to be the most politically correct borough in the whole of the UK, the London borough of Hackney, the type of place that the right-wing press would say they're not allowed to use black bin bags in that borough because it's politically incorrect and all this kind of crazy stuff. And I was really blown away at just how invisible men were when I became a father in 1997. You know, there were mothers and toddlers groups. I would go to the official health services with my daughter, and I would be the only father there, and there'd be notices saying, "Mothers, when you bring your babies here." I had an ongoing battle with my local swimming baths about the mother and toddler baby session, swimming session. And they said, well, you can come. I said, well, why are you calling it the mother and toddler session? It should be the parent and toddler session. So I used to have all this sort of craziness going on. It was my first sort of emergence of being political. 99% of the time I was just being a dad, but I kept saying these little things that really annoyed me. And then I did a bit of writing about being a dad, did some writing about being a dad for magazines in the 90s, and I wrote for an emerging website called Fathers Direct, which about my experience of being a father, which went on to become the Fatherhood Institute. So I got that sort of connection with the sort of the policy level of work in the UK. And you'll be aware of the Fatherhood Institute, I'm assuming, because you've had many speakers from that organisation, and David Bartlett has been here this week. And then I became a separated father, and after a couple of years of making separation work, I thought this system around separated fathers really doesn't work, and I want other dads to know about that. And I went out looking for what was out there and stumbled across a small organisation that was just starting campaigning called Fathers for Justice, and got involved in 2 years in direct action campaigning and lobbying for change and all that kind of stuff, which was great fun. Met a lot of politicians, learnt an awful lot, but I could see quite quickly that it wasn't the whole answer. That, you know, just working on changing law wasn't really actually making a huge difference for fathers of all backgrounds. So I got interested in, well, what's the bigger picture? And I'm a big thinker. I don't like small problems, I like big problems. I once heard someone say, if you want to disappear a problem in your life, get yourself a bigger problem. And it really works, yeah. So I kept trying to make this problem bigger and bigger in my head. It's not just separated fathers, it's all fathers. But then it's not just fathers, this is about men. And it's not just men in my area, it's about men in my country. But then, you know, it's not just about men in my country, it's about men all over the world. And it's not just about men, it's about boys. It's about, oh my goodness, this is big. This is 3.5 billion people, blimey. So it's a problem that I avoided for a very long time because it was so damn big. But at some point, about 4 years ago, I went, you know, I've got one life and I've got a difference to make in the world. So I'm going to take on seeing what it's going to take to make a difference for all men and boys around the world, which is a big ambition. And to look at every problem that men and boys face from cradle to grave. And the theory was that if we set up a small local organisation, which is in my city in Brighton and Hove, which is 50 miles south of London on the sea, a population of about 250,000 people, quite diverse, some very poor areas, some rich areas, a little bit of cultural diversity, so certainly a lot of sexual diversity, big LGBT community, and quite political diversity as well. You get sort of the left and the right and the Greens all in the same city. So a very interesting city with lots of diverse and different problems. And what we thought was because I'd initially thought about setting up a national think tank that looked at sort of all issues as a think tank, but I thought, wouldn't it be much more interesting if we're actually on the grassroots, at the grassroots with real men and boys, finding out what they really need, and then to connect that to what else is happening in the world already, what's happening at a national level and what's happening at an international level. Because my belief was that any problem that men and boys are facing anywhere in the world, and fathers are facing anywhere in the world, someone out there is an expert at resolving it, and we just don't know them yet. I was just having a conversation with Simon about 5 minutes ago, going, oh my God, that guy knows so much. I've been looking for that guy because there's a piece of the jigsaw puzzle that he's got that I've been missing for ages. And that's what this thing about, for me, for building a sort of an informal and loose network really does. You find expertise in it. So I'm about creating a network, a context around work for men and work for fathers and the difference that can make. And that's why I've ended up here, because some of the best work in the world is being done here. So I get to see it, and I can import some of the ideas back to my country, and we can share the knowledge between us. We're an international brotherhood as far as I'm concerned. So, but I'm going to talk about the piece of the jigsaw that we took on locally in terms of fathers. It's an incomplete, it's not an evaluated piece of work, it's a lot of vision. What I do is I'm a visionary, and I don't mean that in an arrogant way, I mean it's a skill, actually something that we all have from birth, but then we tend to lose from the age of 7 onwards. And I think being visionary is important. Being up in the clouds all the time doesn't help, it's a bit la-la, but if we can combine being visionary with actually being rational and actually taking action, that's really helpful. So when I say I'm a visionary, I just ask questions that open up thinking about what's possible. And so the question that I ask around fatherhood is, what does it take to create a father-friendly city? And I'd like you to sit with that question, or community, right? So I'd like you to sit with that question for the duration of this talk and make it relevant to you. I'll make it the male-friendly community if it's more relevant to you. So what will it take to create a really father-friendly community to wrap around the work that you do? So that's the question that I've been living inside in terms of the father's work that I do at a local level. So even when I'm just working with a guy one-to-one, I'm also thinking, how does this fit into the bigger picture, and how could we have actually done a better job for this guy if we had a father-friendly community? So, firstly, father-unfriendly communities. Just one story, just because it's one of the most recent ones from the UK. This guy's called Aftab Khan, and that's his son. They live in the Yorkshire city of, I think it's Bradford, in Yorkshire in England, and that's them on the way to court. And this is just a couple of months ago. So basically, Aftab Khan has 8 children, and his eldest are about 24, I think now, and the youngest was 4. So there's a range of 8 children, 2 adults, 6 at home. So there's 24 years of parenting going on there. Okay? And then the only real serious intervention that, the authorities, the system had with Mr. Khan was in about 2008 when there was a domestic violence incident, and he was charged with ABH, and he was removed from his children's lives, and that was the end of it. Now what comes out in court is that interview, where in that interview he's saying, you've got to go and see her. I tell you, she's crazy. You've got to go and see, at least, please, get a doctor to see the kid. You've got to send it, just get a doctor to check him. She's not feeding him. She's mad. You've got to, and it comes out in court, right? It's ignored. Fast forward 2 years in 2010, and the youngest son, 4-year-old Hamza, is found in the basement, mummified, and he's been starved to death. He's been there for 2 years. And there are 5 other children in the house, aged 5 to 13. So, I mean, it's extreme, right? And I'm just showing it because it's an extreme case of the kind of thing that does happen if we don't have, not just father-friendly, but, you know, family-friendly and a support system, a safety system that works. So, I'll go into some nicer stuff, but it's just worth bearing in mind that the extreme end, if we don't get this stuff right, then that's the kind of extreme thing that can kind of happen. So I think fatherhood's quite interesting. You might say it's I sometimes say education's the father of all the root of all kids' issues, but I think fatherhood could be argued to be at the root of all men's issues. You'll know this kind of stuff. I've got the statistics from the UK in my latest book, but just to refresh the mind, so the kids are more likely to do well at school. If they've got dad involved, less likely to be excluded from school, less likely to have mental health problems, less likely to die from suicide, less likely to commit crime, less likely to smoke, drink, and take drugs. So it has an impact on health. There's a lot of stuff that shows that father involvement has an impact on health later in life as a knock-on effect. Lower risk of teenage pregnancy, less likely to become homeless, less likely to become unemployed, and more likely to escape poverty. Obviously, these things affect boys and girls. I tend to focus on the impact on boys generally because I focus on the men and boys world. So we've been looking at the idea of what would it take to create a father-friendly community, and it's great to hear people over here. Andrew did a session on generative fathering the other day. We talk about the generative approach and how important that is, and I'm talking about a generative whole community approach, so not just a generative approach to when I work with this one dad here, but how do we create a context that actually just generates fathers like they pop up without any work whatsoever. And I assert that every dad, the one thing, no matter what a dad's up to, that in there somewhere, that every dad wants to be the best dad they can be. And that's the seed that I'm looking for whenever I work with a father. However he's showing up, at the level of behavior, at the level of intention, I know in there is an intention to be the best dad he can be. Some principles of generative father work taken from, there's a website in the States which I list at the end, which is worth looking at if you're interested in more about the generative approach. But it's a lot about, just making that assumption that dads actually are very capable. I was really taken by the talk by, is it Richard Aston from Big Buddy Scheme in New Zealand, where he was saying basically they connect mentors with fatherless boys, and basically saying we start from the principle that all men are good. And then we have a really rigorous screening process in place to make sure that no one gets through the filter, but we start from the principle that all men are good. And then we don't train them because they know how to have a relationship with young men and grow up young men. There's a wisdom that goes way back. So making that assumption that men are really capable at parenting is a really good starting point. So that's, the generative or the assets-led approach rather than the deficit approach or the risk management approach. And it doesn't mean that you don't manage risk, right? It just means that in the background is the assumption. A couple more principles there. I'll just leave them there for a moment. And you can start to see as you look through this that some of this is not just about one-to-one, it's about culture. So, engaging in respectful, accurate and constructive discourse about fathers and fathering. It's about what culture are we creating in our conversation about fathers. And some great stuff on that website there, fatherwork.byu.edu. So that's kind of the background context. The question is, how do we create a father-friendly community? using a generative approach. I use a model called the integral model. Lots of detail in it, but one of the most simple aspects of it is this quadrant. It's created by a guy called Ken Wilber, who's a close personal showbiz friend of Warren's. And they've done some interviews together, really worth listening to. I recommend that. But basically, it says if you want to get the full picture of any situation, small or large, you want to look at these 4 areas. There's the stuff that's going on internally on the left there, the stuff that's going on externally on the right there. The stuff across the top is the individual stuff. The stuff across the bottom is the collective stuff. And what tends to happen, I find, when we've worked with men, is that it's all like when you sit down with a bunch of professionals and start talking about engaging with men, and you ask them where are the problems located, they start off and they're all located in the upper right-hand corner. Men do this, dads do that, dads do the other. And as you spend time working with people throughout the day, you start to go, oh, actually, there are some other stuff. The intentional stuff over on the left, which often isn't seen, is where I work. It's the intention to be the best father I possibly can. But also we look at what are the systemic barriers, and we look at what's going on culturally. And if we can be addressing all of that, then it becomes much easier to do work with men. It just becomes much easier to do work with anyone if you actually cover all those bases. Or at least have them in your awareness, right? So these are the questions you might want to ask when you start off. Is your community father-friendly? So do you relate to every dad as a great dad? Are there clear pathways to support dads? That's the sort of the external stuff. Is there somewhere they can go and follow some steps to get help? Have you considered what the systemic barriers are, and have you considered what the cultural barriers are? And it was a very, very simple model for father-friendly community. There's 3 levels of activity going on: the one-to-one work, what's happening at the community level, group level, and then the sort of the systemic strategic networks that wrap around that. If you go back to these, that's 1, 2, 3. If you go back to the quadrant, that's the I across the top, the we and the it's. The I, the individual one-to-one, the we, the community stuff, and the it's, the systemic networking stuff. So one-to-one stuff. So if I'm looking at how do we make our community the most father-friendly community going, I want to be aware of what's already, I want to map what's already out there. I want to really think about who are my partners, and who's my team? I know I'm just doing my little project here, but who's my team in the city? Who's my team in this community? Who's already out there? Who's already out there doing one-to-one work, whatever that is, whether it's therapeutic, whether it's advocacy, whether it's sort of mentoring, whether it's just informal kind of connections. And I think what's interesting about this approach, what I've really tried to do is to be as inclusive as possible. And we talk a lot about inclusivity and diversity, but I find it often doesn't exist. It's like we're inclusive of a certain kind of approach. And I've really taken a stand in the UK to put people in a room who don't want to be with each other and make them be friends. I run a conference in the UK, not as big and as glamorous as yours, but very lovely and delightful. And at the last one we did at the end of September, one of the highlights for me was we've got, and I mix people from different perspectives, not just political perspectives, but also people who are campaigners and coming from a sort of a lobbying perspective, and people who are working at the grassroots. I like to mix them up. It's good to sort of get a sense of how we all fit together. Right? And one of my favourite moments for me was we've got this sort of right-wing anti-feminist political party that's trying to stand in seats against the Conservatives at the next election, called Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. And God bless him. I agree with him on all the issues he highlights and none of the interpretation of the problems or the solutions. And which is true of quite a lot of people, actually. And I looked over at one point, and there he is, the most right-wing, anti-feminist man in the room, and he's standing next to the most Marxist, pro-feminist man in the room, and they're chatting the way, and they both looked over at me guiltily. And they sort of sided up to me afterwards and went, it's actually an all right bloke, actually, isn't he? Don't tell anyone I said that. Don't tell anyone we're friends. So I think what that points to is actually if we allow people to meet and know each other as men, from the heart, it enables us to cut through the kind of the barriers and clashes that occur when we relate to each other as our viewpoint or our perspective. I think that's really important. And one of the ways I do that is uniting people around vision, because I find at the level of vision, most people are united. Who wouldn't want to live in a really father-friendly city, or a really, parent-friendly city? Who wouldn't want that? So then, this is, just to pull it out a bit, this is the context of all men's work. So when we took on not just doing father work, but all men's work, and we tried to work out, well, how does it all fit together? And pretty much I find that most work, if you're trying to work out how to join the dots between people, how they connect. So I find that most work with men will fall into one of those 4 quadrants. And I link people, like I said, I link people around vision. So when I talk about fathers, I talk about helping every dad to be the best dad he can be. When I talk about health, I talk about helping men live long, happy, healthy lives. When I talk about safety, this is really interesting, safety. Go on Google, I don't think it still does it. I came up with this phrase, keeping men and boys safe. Didn't want to do the kind of like, stopping men being violent. I wanted to broaden it and try and change the thinking around it, not to deny men's violence or to exclude people who work in there, but to think about, hang on, if a bloke's being violent, he's not safe. He's not safe to himself, he's not safe to others. So I came up with this phrase, keeping men and boys safe. I Googled it to see if anyone else was using it, and Google said, do you mean keeping women safe? And doesn't that just point to what's going on at a cultural level, right? What do you mean keeping men and boys safe? Are you mad? They're the cause of all the problems. So, and then anything to do with boys. So I've got these sort of 2 maps that sort of map onto each other. So we've got these four areas of men's work, and obviously health's really broad, yeah. Physical, mental, sexual, spiritual, all the rest of it. Emotional well-being, social well-being, and then these. Are people working on a one-to-one basis? Are they working at a community basis? Or are they working at a strategic basis? So I find out, so where do they all fit together? And what I do as well is I didn't just do this at a city level. I went, right, wouldn't it be really amazing if I can find I mapped it out to a national level and an international level. So how can I find the best, what I'm up to in the world is finding the best person in all those fields in the world, and what a network that would be. And quite a lot of them are located in this country, so it's bloody great to be here. We've got 1 or 2 in our country too, Let's not be competitive about this, right? No, let's be competitive about this. I can see Julian watching me going, don't mention the cricket again, Glenn, don't mention the cricket again. So back to the 3 elements, so the groups, so at group level, and again, it's been diverse, right? It's not just going, there's only one, I've had people go, if you're working with men, you must have 2 trained therapists in the room and no one else must be allowed to, yes. So, therapeutic support groups, learning groups, like we do, we do a 9-week course for dads, but community groups in schools. We've got some great guys in our city who go into schools and form a group with the new dads, and they form a bond. And the school feed back and say, do you know, we've never had dads so involved in school because you did a 6-week program at the beginning, which was just for dads. So these little things have a knock-on and ripple effect. We think, oh, well, you just did a 6-week course with dads. No, you built a community in that school, which is having an impact for years to come. So groups are really, really powerful. We're never really aware of the ripples. I'm being really amazed by the men's well-being guys here. I keep coming across guys having amazing conversations and going, wow, you're an amazing guy. Where are you from? Oh, I'm with men's well-being. So you've got this community of guys, and individually, many of them are out doing stuff. That's really powerful stuff you guys do. You're generating yourselves by coming together in community and then going out and doing stuff. Really, really powerful. And then just really sort of simple social stuff. We found some of the most powerful stuff to get men engaged in the one-to-one stuff. It's just to have really simple community stuff where there is no pressure. There's nothing arranged, it's just a space. One of the themes that comes up about men's work over and over again, and it's never written in this language in the literature, but one of the barriers that men face to accessing services is they don't like people effing interfering with them. If you want to create a good project for men and boys, one of the key principles is let them do it themselves. So we create lots of spaces where men can just do it themselves with their kids, and they're delighted to have a couple of hours where they can spend some time with their kids without interference, without someone telling them what to do, without someone telling them that they're doing it wrong. And in those spaces, some of the conversations really take place. This unemployed, tattooed lad sidled up to me one time. He was early 30s. His son was 12, and he said to me, I'd really like to, I can't write. I'd really like to learn to read and write because I can't read to my son, and I'm trying to get a job, and my missus is earning all the money, and I have to keep bothering her, helping me fill out the application forms. And he just wanted to be a protector and provider for his kid. And I was just like, I can't believe this guy. What a lovely guy, what a committed guy. He had the intention to be the best dad he could be. And he was still in the family after 12 years. How did that guy go through our city, through our system, for 12 years with no one picking up that he couldn't read and write, And he had a son that he wanted to read to, and not being able to read was preventing him from getting a job to provide for his son. It's bonkers. So in that sort of like little informal conversation, we're able then to push him in the right direction. A couple of examples of really good groups, because I'm interested in how do we replicate stuff. I'm so excited by how you guys replicate the Men's Sheds movement, how that's growing from the grassroots up. We've got a little one that's a little bit like that. It's a church-led group called Who Let the Dads Out, and they use church halls that already exist. There's 26,000 church playgroups in the UK, and there was only about 5 just for fathers. So they've actually just created a template, and then across the country now, loads are popping up. And Young Dads TV, this is a brilliant project. It connects young dads right across the country using social media. Because they did some research and found that young dads aren't connected to each other, they're not connected to services, and they're not connected to information. So they're building up this database of information that's recorded by these guys. They take them for a little workshop where they go, oh, right, I'm going to change my first nappy, and that information's all out there for other young dads to find. And bit by bit, they're building sort of self-regulating, self-running young fathers groups around the country. And two of these guys are in my city, and they're now on the advisory panel advising the government. And they're like, oh, wow, this guy here, Joe, he wasn't seeing his kids. His kids were going to be taken into care, because as is so often the case, mum's not able to do it, and they don't think of dad. In this case, the social workers worked with him so that he could look at, he's a single dad. He's a single dad. It was never going to happen but for a social worker taking a stand, and now he's advising the government on policy on young fathers. And that's because the one-to-one work, the community work, and the connection to the strategic network. And I just want to say very briefly, we can hold different perspectives in this kind of model, and I agree with you about the Quiet Revolution, and I heartily disagree with you about the Quiet Revolution at the same time, and this is an example of it. Joe was part of the Quiet Revolution, but also is part of the noisy revolution because it's getting his story heard at top level, and I think it's horses for courses. There's times when we need the noise, and there's times when we need the silent work. So, finally, networks. It's like local networks. If you know people, they'll refer to you. If you've got practitioner networks, you can share good practice. You can train other practitioners in father-friendly stuff. If you're connected through support services, you know where to direct people. Soft policy networks, which I mean is just like you kind of know the people at a local level and able to take advantage of policy and get these little tweaks, a bit of funding there, a bit of funding elsewhere, but also the hard policy networks. We need campaigners, we need smart campaigners lobbying for change. And good practice network. This is an example of a good practice network. Here I am in the UK, learning about what you're doing in Australia and sharing a little bit of what we're doing. I do a list of 10 key barriers that men face to, this is all men face to services. It's all based on a load of, these aren't my ideas, it's taken from a load of research across social care, fathers work, mental health work, work with men around debt, all sorts of stuff, and I picked out the key themes. These are the 10 key themes, the 10 key barriers. It won't be relevant in all cases, but if you want to know what the barriers are, look at that list and see if one of those is in there for you. And barriers are really important. We think about the one-to-one work we do, but if you can remove a barrier, that enables a load of guys to suddenly get work. So that's the ultimate goal for me, building social capital, making sure that every man and boy everywhere in the world is just one conversation away from the help and support he needs. And there's a bit there on social capital. It's an interesting thing. I came up with the notion of male social capital. By male social capital, I mean an individual man or boy's ability to give help and get help. Is he just one conversation from the help and support he needs? And this is a more kind of like health work-based definition of social capital from the UK. So think of the bonds, the bridges, and the links. Bonds are strong personal connections. Bridges link you to other communities, other organizations. And links are sort of hierarchical. Can you make connections up and down? Do you have social mobility? Can you make connections up and down? So it's important for you as a practitioner to have those. Really important for an individual man or boy to have those if he's ever to get the help he needs. That's an example of a social worker in the UK who's been breaking down the barriers within his social work practice. He did his PhD and came to the realization that he'd been anti-male all his career and took on addressing that, owning it, and then put a system in place in his social service in Islington in London. That's what one of his social workers said about that work. Some of these examples are on my blog, Helping Men. I try and collect good practice and put it on a blog out in the public so people can see it. Sir Roger up in the, I'm nearly finished, Sir Roger Ollie up in the northeast of England. I love this guy. He had a service in the northeast, only 8% of, children's centre, only 8% of users were dads. And he, in the space of about 6 months, he created a project called Dads Matter 2, and he had a serious gender equality issue. And that was that after that 4 to 6 months, more men were using the service than women. Proves what's possible when you remove, and he removed barriers, and he got people just asking, where's dad? That's his book, worth looking at. It's got lots of practitioners' ideas from around the UK, engaging fathers in the early years. And there's Joe, do it for Joe. I know that if I hadn't gone down to this, if I wasn't networked and connected, Joe wouldn't be where he is now. He's done it all himself, but if I hadn't created the network, there would have been no pathway for him to go from his local children's centre to me, to Young Dads TV, to the Prime Minister. So, you know, he was able to be socially mobile because someone like me was prepared to make those links. You can do that for other people too. He's done all the work, but I made the path, and he found it. That's my book. Buy it. It's an e-book. It's really good. Okay.